$12,000 for a strip of dirt nobody's walked on in 30 years. The young man in the gray suit said it loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, and then he laughed. Two associates standing behind him laughed with him, the way people laugh when they've already decided the meeting is over. The teller looked down at her keyboard. A woman waiting in line pretended to read a brochure. The old man across the desk did not move. He sat with his hat in his lap and his hands folded on top of it, and waited until the laughter stopped on its own. Then he said, "I'd like that in writing, please. The refusal." The young man stopped smiling. He glanced at his associates. He told the old man they didn't issue written refusals on informal offers. The old man nodded once. He said, "Then I'd like the name of someone who does." Outside the window of the Cattlemen's National Bank in Sumner County, Kansas, the parking lot was empty, except for a 1994 Ford pickup with a dent in the back fender. The clock above the teller's window read 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. 48 hours later, a $58 million commercial development project would be frozen by a single sheet of paper folded in the breast pocket of the man with the hat in his lap. But on that Tuesday morning, no one in the bank knew that yet. Not the manager, not the lawyers in Wichita who had drafted the offer, not the developer who had already broken ground on the access road, not even the old man himself entirely. His name was Earl Dempsey. He was 71 years old. He lived 17 miles outside the town of Wellington in Sumner County, Kansas, on 340 acres he had purchased over the course of 43 years, one parcel at a time, the largest of which was 80 acres, and the smallest was a 4-acre wedge along the county road that he had bought from a widow in 1986 for $1,800. He had not inherited a single foot of it. His father had been a tenant farmer his whole life, and had died at 64, owing $2,400 to a feed store in Caldwell. Earl had decided at 23 that he would not die owing anyone anything, and he would not die without leaving something behind that had his name on the deed. He had worked other men's farms for the first 11 years. He had driven a grain truck for 9 of those years on top of the farming. He had missed his sister's wedding in 1972 because he was harvesting wheat for a man named Coleman who paid by the acre and not by the day. He had eaten the same lunch, a ham sandwich and a thermos of coffee, for 31 years. He had bought his first 60 acres in 1981 with $14,000 he had saved across a decade, and the deed had been signed at a kitchen table in Wellington on a Saturday morning in October. He had walked the property line that afternoon alone, in work boots, and when he reached the back corner, he had stood there for a long time before walking back. His wife, Marlene, had been with him through all of it. She had kept the books in a green ledger she bought new every 5 years from a stationery store in Wichita. She had recorded every payment, every receipt, every fence post and bag of seed and tax assessment. She had died in October of 2019 of a stroke at home in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. She was 68. Earl had buried her under the post oak at the back of the property on the high ground where the land sloped down to the creek. The creek was called Slate Creek, and it ran through the southwest corner of his property, and it was the reason any of this happened. Because 3 miles to the east, in the spring of 2024, a development firm out of Oklahoma City had announced plans for a 1,400-acre logistics park, distribution warehouses, truck depots, a rail spur. Total projected build-out, $58 million. The firm was called Meridian Industrial Holdings. The lead developer was a man named Brent Halsey, 38 years old, MBA from the University of Texas. He had assembled the parcels for the project across 18 months. He had paid above market for most of them. He had described the project in a press release as a generational investment in the economic future of South Central Kansas. There was only one problem with the project, and Brent Halsey did not know it was a problem yet. The logistics park required water rights. Specifically, it required a continuous flow easement along Slate Creek to feed the cooling systems for the railside equipment and the wash bays for the truck depot. The engineering report had been clear. Without that easement, the project's operational costs would increase by an estimated $4.2 million annually, and the timeline would be set back by at least 2 years pending alternative water sourcing. The continuous flow easement along Slate Creek required the cooperation of every landowner along the creek's eastern run, 11 properties in total. 10 of them had signed easement agreements with Meridian Industrial Holdings between June and October of 2024 at an average payment of $38,000 per parcel. The 11th property belonged to Earl Dempsey. Earl had not been approached. Not in June, not in October, not in the months after. He had read about the logistics park in the Wellington Daily News and had assumed, because no one had contacted him, that his land was not part of it. He was wrong about that. But it was not his mistake to correct. In late January of 2026, Brent Halsey's office sent its first letter to Earl. The letter offered $12,000 for the easement. It described the offer as a fair market valuation reflecting the limited utility of the parcel in question. It gave a response window of 14 days. The letter was signed by an associate at the firm whose name Earl could not pronounce. Earl read the letter twice. Then he drove to Wellington and showed it to his attorney, a man named Mitchell Crane, 54 years old, who had handled the closings on the last 6 parcels Earl had purchased and had drafted Marlene's will. Crane read the letter, looked at Earl and said, "Earl, this is low. This is so low it's almost an insult." Earl said, "I know." Crane asked him what he wanted to do. Earl said he wanted to make a counteroffer. Crane asked how much. Earl said he didn't know yet. He said he wanted to look at something first. What Earl wanted to look at was in a metal box in his attic, but he didn't go to the box that day. He drove home, parked the truck, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote his counteroffer on a piece of yellow legal paper. He offered the easement for $340,000. He delivered it to Crane the next morning. Crane sent it to Meridian Industrial Holdings on January 31, 2026. 3 weeks passed. On February 21st, Earl received a phone call from a woman at Meridian's offices who told him, politely, that his counteroffer was not within the range of valuations the firm could justify to its investors. She said the firm was prepared to increase its initial offer to $15,000 and that this would be its final offer. She suggested that Earl reconsider, given that the project would proceed regardless and that his parcel's value would not increase by holding out. Earl thanked her. He hung up. He called Crane. He told Crane to reject the $15,000 and reaffirm the $340,000. Crane did. On March 4th, the young man in the gray suit walked into the Cattlemen's National Bank in Sumner County, where Earl was making his weekly deposit, and offered him $12,000 for the easement, on the spot, in cash, in front of the tellers and the customers in line behind him. The young man was named Tyler Voss. He was 32 years old. He was an associate from Meridian's outside counsel, sent specifically because the firm had decided Earl needed to be approached outside the legal channel, in a public setting, to create a moment of clarity about the seriousness of the situation. It was a tactic Tyler had used before, on 3 other holdouts in 3 other counties. It had worked every time. It did not work that morning. Earl walked out of the bank with Tyler's name in his pocket, written on a deposit slip. He drove home. He parked the truck. He went into the house, set his hat on the counter, and walked up the narrow stairs to the attic. The attic of Earl's farmhouse was not finished. It was insulated and floored, and had a single bare bulb hanging from a string. It smelled of dust and old wood. Marlene had used it for storage, and after she died, Earl had not gone up there for almost a year. When he had finally gone up, in the summer of 2020, he had found that she had organized everything. Boxes labeled by year in her handwriting, folders inside the boxes labeled by category, receipts, tax records, correspondence, insurance, property documents. 40 years of their life on this land, sorted and stored in clear plastic bins along the north wall. Earl knelt in front of the bin labeled 1971-1975 in Marlene's handwriting. He opened the latch. He took out a folder labeled Slate Creek, Original Deed Restrictions. Inside the folder was a single document, 4 pages long, that had been folded once, lengthwise, and stapled at the corner. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The typescript was uneven, the kind a typewriter made when the ribbon was running thin. The document was dated April 11th, 1971. The document was a deed restriction recorded against the original 60-acre parcel that Earl had purchased in 1981. It had been filed by the previous owner, a man named Walter Henley, who had owned the land from 1958 until his death in 1980, and it had been recorded in the Sumner County Clerk's office in Wellington in April of 1971. The restriction concerned water rights along the eastern bank of Slate Creek, where it ran through the property. Walter Henley had filed the restriction after a dispute with a neighbor over irrigation withdrawals in the summer of 1970. The language was specific. It granted the property's owner, and only the property's owner, the right to control any continuous flow easement along the creek's eastern run within the parcel boundaries, in perpetuity. It further specified that no commercial easement could be granted on the parcel without the recorded consent of the owner, and that such consent, if given, would automatically transfer easement control rights for the entire downstream watershed within Sumner County to that owner for a period of 50 years. Earl held the document in his hand and read it 3 times. Then he folded it back the way it had been folded and placed it in his shirt pocket. He climbed down from the attic. He drove to Wellington. He laid the document on Mitchell Crane's desk without saying anything. Crane read it once. Then he read it again. Then he stood up and walked to his window and stood there for a long time looking out at the parking lot. When he turned around, he said, "Earl, do you know what this is?" Earl said, "I think I do." Crane said, "I don't think you do. Not all of it." What Crane explained to Earl over the next 90 minutes was this. The 1971 deed restriction had never been overturned, never been amended, and never been challenged. It had been recorded properly. It had transferred with every sale of the parcel. It applied to the easement Meridian Industrial Holdings was attempting to acquire. And because the language specified that consent on this parcel transferred easement control rights for the entire downstream watershed for 50 years, it meant that whoever owned this parcel could, at any time, file to revoke or modify any easement Meridian had already negotiated with the other 10 property owners. Every one of those agreements was now contingent on Earl's parcel. Not because of Earl, because of Walter Henley in 1971, after a fight with a neighbor over irrigation. Crane said, "Earl, the other 10 easements are worthless without your signature. The entire $58 million project is sitting on this piece of paper." Earl did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "What do we do?" Crane said, "We file a notice of the restriction with the county. We send formal notification to Meridian, and we wait." Earl said, "How long?" Crane said, 48 hours, maybe less. The notice was filed on the morning of March 6th. The formal notification was hand-delivered to Meridian Industrial Holdings office in Oklahoma City the same afternoon. The phone call from Brent Halsey came at 9:14 a.m. on March 7th. Crane took the call in his office with Earl sitting across from him. Halsey's voice on speakerphone was no longer the voice of a man who laughed in bank lobbies. He asked what it would take to resolve the matter. Crane said his client was open to a mediation. Halsey said he could have a mediator in Wellington by Monday. Crane said Wednesday would be fine. The mediation was held in a small office on the 2nd floor of the Sumner County Courthouse in Wellington on the morning of March 12, 2026. The room had a long oak table and 4 chairs on each side. The mediator was a retired district judge named Carl Thiessen, 71 years old, who had been on the bench for 28 years before retiring in 2019. He had read the file the night before. Brent Halsey arrived first, with 3 lawyers, 2 from Wichita, 1 from Oklahoma City. They wore suits. They carried matching leather folders. They sat down on one side of the table and laid out their materials and waited. Earl arrived alone with Mitchell Crane. He was wearing a clean white shirt that Marlene's sister had ironed for him that morning. He carried no folder. His document was in his shirt pocket. Crane carried a single, thin file. They sat down on the other side of the table. Judge Thiessen looked at both sides and said, "Let's begin." Halsey's lead lawyer spoke first. He spoke for 19 minutes. He outlined the project, the investment, the public benefit, the difficult position the firm now found itself in due to what he described as a technical clause of questionable contemporary applicability. He proposed a settlement of $250,000 for the easement. He emphasized the firm's preference for resolution over litigation. He sat down. Crane stood up. He spoke for less than a minute. He said, "My client is not selling the easement. My client is offering to license it. The license terms are as follows: an initial payment of $1.4 million, a continuing royalty of 3% of gross revenue from the operations dependent on the easement, payable quarterly, for 40 years. A reversion clause allowing my client or his heirs to terminate the easement upon 6 months' notice in the event of any material breach. And full restoration bonds posted in escrow for the duration of the easement." The room was quiet. Halsey's lead lawyer started to respond. Judge Thiessen held up his hand. He said, "Before you respond, counselor, I'd like to see the document." Crane reached across the table and handed him the 4-page deed restriction from 1971, folded the way Walter Henley had folded it 55 years before. Thiessen read it in silence. Then he turned to Halsey's lead lawyer and said, "Counselor, I've been a judge in this state for almost 3 decades. This document is exactly what it appears to be. The terms my client's counsel has proposed are reasonable in light of it. I would suggest you accept them or be prepared to explain to your investors why an easement you believed you had purchased for $38,000 on average is now worth nothing." He set the document down. He said, "I'll give you 20 minutes." Halsey and his lawyers left the room. They came back in 14. They accepted every term, every single one. The agreement was drafted that afternoon and signed the following morning. The initial payment of $1.4 million was wired to an escrow account at the Cattlemen's National Bank in Sumner County on March 16, 2026. The first quarterly royalty payment, calculated on partial quarter operations, was scheduled for September. Earl drove home alone that afternoon. He parked the truck. He walked into the house, set his hat on the counter, and climbed the stairs to the attic. He knelt in front of the bin labeled 1971-1975. He opened the latch. He took the 4-page document out of his shirt pocket and refolded it the way Walter Henley had folded it, the way Marlene had filed it, the way it had been folded for 55 years. He placed it back in the folder. He placed the folder back in the bin. He closed the latch. He sat on the attic floor for a few minutes, listening to the wind move through the roof above him. Then he climbed down the stairs, put his hat back on, and went outside to check the fence along the west pasture, where a post had been leaning since February and he had not yet had time to fix it. Earl Dempsey was not the only one who got a letter from Meridian Industrial Holdings. There were others. Different counties, different parcels, different deeds, some of them older than Walter Henley's, some of them stranger. The same young men in gray suits, the same offers, the same laugh. What happened next, in a county 400 miles from Wellington, to a woman who hadn't opened her late husband's filing cabinet in 11 years, changed how this entire kind of project gets done in this part of the country. Subscribe. The next one is bigger than this. Paste your script.